Life is unpredictable, full of people who believe they can do whatever they want without consequences. Some think rules don't apply to them. Some act as if the world revolves around them. And then there are those who push their luck just a little too far, only to realize they've messed with the wrong person. This is a story about them. It starts on an ordinary day, in an ordinary town, where seemingly ordinary people go about their business. But scratch beneath the surface and you'll find something more unsettling. Jack, a hard-working employee at a home improvement store, has learned to deal with difficult customers. He's seen it all, the impatient, the rude, the outright nasty, but nothing could have prepared him for the man who would turn his workday into a living nightmare. When Jack stepped outside to help a customer load 50 bales of pine straw, he didn't expect to find a stranger inside the locked storage trailer. The man had climbed over the gate as if he were his personal property. Jack, maintaining his composure, asked him to step out, but the man scoffed. He had been waiting, he claimed, for far too long, and his time was more valuable than whatever rules the store had in place. The moment Jack insisted, the man's attitude shifted. His voice dropped an octave, his stance hardened, and then came the threat. If Jack ever dared to wave at him again like that, he'd make sure Jack regretted it. There was a moment of silence, thick and charged, as Jack measured his options. Should he back down or stand his ground? The answer came quickly. He reported the incident to his manager, who wasted no time making calls. Within hours, the company of the entitled customer received a message loud and clear. Their employee was no longer welcome in the store, and if he showed up again, trespassing charges would be filed. The man had thought he could do whatever he pleased. He was wrong. Meanwhile, across town, in a store that once thrived on good management, chaos was brewing. Grumpy was more than just a nickname, it was a legend. He was the kind of boss people respected, the kind that made work feel like a team effort instead of a slow, soul-sucking grind. But when illness forced him to step away, his replacement arrived like a storm on the horizon. Wilhelm, the new manager, had never worked on the floor, never lifted heavy stock, never dealt with customers face-to-face. He saw employees as numbers, profit margins as the only thing that mattered. Within weeks, the store's once thriving environment turned into something resembling a prison camp. Shifts were extended, overtime denied, and morale plummeted. Employees walked out in frustration, while Wilhelm simply replaced them with younger, more naive workers who didn't yet understand how the world worked. And then, 6 months later, Grumpy returned. He wasn't the same as before, limping slightly, leaning on a cane. But his presence alone was enough to shift the air. He listened, he learned, and then he acted. No one knew exactly what he was planning. But when the store suddenly closed for an unexpected staff meeting, tension crackled in the air. Grumpy had always played fair, but everyone knew he was about to make things right, and Wilhelm had no idea what was coming for him. But this isn't just a story about employees standing up for themselves. Sometimes revenge is personal. Alex had always been a good neighbor, the type to keep to himself but wave politely when passing by. That changed the moment Pete moved in. Pete, with his black Mustang that screamed down the quiet suburban streets every night, with his booming laughter and roaring engine that shattered the peaceful evenings. When neighbors complained, Pete's response was simple. He had paid for his house, he would do what he wanted, so Alex decided to teach him a lesson. He moved his fire pit back to its original location, the one he had carefully avoided for years because of the way the wind carried the smoke, and then he waited. The first time Pete and his friends gathered outside, revving their engines, Alex threw the wettest, foulest wood he could find onto the fire. Within minutes, thick smoke billowed straight into Pete's yard. The Mustang crew coughed and cursed before retreating inside, but every time they re-emerged, Alex added more. For weeks the cycle continued, until one evening, Pete and his wife finally approached Alex. They asked, politely this time, if he could ease up on the smoke. Alex looked at them, then at Pete, and let his words hang in the air. Funny, isn't it, how sometimes we don't realize how much we're bothering someone until we're on the receiving end? Pete understood. The Mustang roared no more. But if that was one kind of justice, some took a different approach. A man who had lost everything living out of his car had learned to let things go, until one day In a crowded library parking lot, a woman in a sleek, expensive SUV threw open her door and slammed it hard into his vehicle. She looked right at him, eyes cold and indifferent, and walked away without a word. If she had apologized, even just a quick sorry, he would have let it slide, but the silence, the complete lack of regard ignited something inside him. His fingers tightened around his car handle, his pulse thrummed in his ears, and then, before he could think twice, he swung his door open. Once, twice, 3 times. He didn't stop until her pristine car bore the marks of her carelessness. As he drove away, the rush of satisfaction settled deep in his chest. Some might call him the villain, but in that moment he felt like he had finally won. And so the stories unfold. Some find justice, some find revenge, and others learn the hard way that no one is above the rules. In a world where entitlement runs rampant, where people think they can do whatever they want, there's always someone willing to remind them otherwise. The question is, how far would you go to teach them a lesson? Jack had always known that working retail meant dealing with entitled customers, but nothing could have prepared him for the man who stormed into the store that afternoon. It started like any other shift. The sun was beating down, and Jack had just finished a phone call when he was called outside to help a customer pick up 50 bales of pine straw. Simple enough, but as soon as he stepped outside, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A man was standing inside the locked trailer, surrounded by stacks of pine straw. The gate was locked, and yet there he was. The guy had climbed over, completely ignoring the clear boundary. Jack sighed and waved him over, motioning for him to step out. At first, the man didn't react. He just stood there, arms crossed, his face twisted in impatience. Then he finally muttered something about waiting forever and how no one had come to help him. Jack, still keeping his cool, explained that the gate was locked for a reason and that he needed to step out. That was when everything changed. The man's face darkened, his hands clenched into fists. He stepped forward, eyes locked onto Jack like a predator sizing up its prey. His voice dropped to a low growl as he spat out the words. "You better hope I don't come back here after work and teach you a lesson." Jack blinked, stunned by the sheer aggression. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply told the man to leave. A locked area, and now he was being threatened. For a second, he considered backing down, brushing it off, but something inside him snapped. No! He wasn't going to let some entitled stranger intimidate him. Without another word, he turned and walked straight to his manager's office. By the end of the day, a call had been made to the man's employer. The store was banning him permanently, and if he showed up again, the police would be involved. Jack never saw the man again, but he could only hope that the next time he thought about pulling a stunt like that, he'd remember the consequences. While Jack was dealing with threats, another battle was raging in a completely different store. Grumpy had been the kind of boss everyone loved, tough but fair, a man who understood that happy employees meant better business. But when he fell ill and had to take time off, everything changed. Wilhelm arrived like a storm, a young, arrogant regional manager who had never worked a day in his life on the store floor. He had a degree and an ego to match, and the first thing he did was tear down everything Grumpy had built. Schedules were changed at the last minute, quotas were raised to impossible levels, and suddenly employees were expected to do 2 jobs for the price of 1. The biggest insult of all came when Wilhelm forced the store workers to cover shifts at a newly opened supermarket that shared their loading dock. It didn't matter that they had their own responsibilities. It didn't matter that they were exhausted. If they refused, they were written up. 2 write-ups meant termination. The loading crew who started their shifts at 5 in the morning were now being ordered to unload the supermarket's shipments first, even if it meant delaying their own deliveries. The store that had once been the number 1 in customer satisfaction was now falling apart, and Wilhelm didn't care. He was making money. That was all that mattered to him. Then, after 6 months of suffering, something changed. Grumpy came back. When he walked through the doors, the atmosphere shifted. Employees whispered, eyes filled with something they hadn't felt in months. Hope. At first, Wilhelm didn't seem concerned. After all, he still outranked Grumpy. But what he didn't know was that Grumpy had a plan. The first thing he did was talk to the head carpenter, the one department Wilhelm hadn't dared to mess with because they were responsible for the store's highest sales. The carpenter told him Everything. The forced labor, the unpaid overtime, the threats. Grumpy listened, his expression unreadable. Then, over the next week, he met with every department, quietly gathering information, and with each conversation, his anger grew. The final straw came when he confronted the supermarket manager and discovered that Wilhelm had been taking a cut from the unpaid labor. Then came the night of the meeting. Employees gathered after closing, nerves buzzing with anticipation. Grumpy stood in front of them, his voice calm but firm. "Starting tomorrow, no one except me will set foot in this store. If anyone calls, direct them to me." Confusion rippled through the room, but no one questioned him. The next morning the store remained closed. Calls flooded in from headquarters demanding answers, and Grumpy had them all. He presented written testimonies from employees, records of forced labor, and the missing overtime payments. Wilhelm had thought he was untouchable, but now, with undeniable proof in front of the company executives, he was finished. Within a day he was fired, employees were offered their jobs back with better pay, and just like that the store returned to what it once was, a place people actually wanted to work. But not all battles were fought in the workplace. Some were fought in the quiet streets of a peaceful neighborhood, or at least it had been peaceful before Pete moved in. Alex had lived in his house for over a decade. He loved sitting on his porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, listening to the distant hum of life. Then Pete arrived with his brand-new black Mustang. At first, Alex had ignored it. A few revs here and there weren't a big deal, but then it became a nightly ritual. Pete would roar down the streets, his engine screaming through the quiet, shattering the peace. Neighbors complained, but Pete didn't care. He had paid for his house, and he would do what he wanted. That was when Alex decided to teach him a lesson. He had an old fire pit, one he hadn't used in years because the wind carried the smoke straight into his neighbor's yard. But now it seemed like the perfect time to bring it back. The next time Pete and his friends gathered outside, laughing and revving the Mustang, Alex started a fire. And not just any fire. He loaded it with the wettest, foulest wood he could find. Within minutes, thick smoke curled into the air, drifting straight into Pete's backyard. The laughter stopped. The revving engine sputtered to silence. Pete and his friends coughed, waving their hands, before retreating inside. But every time they returned, Alex added more. This went on for weeks. Finally, Pete and his wife came over, looking tired and defeated. She politely asked if he could stop, explaining that the smoke was ruining their backyard experience. Alex simply smiled. "Funny, isn't it? Sometimes we don't realize how much we're bothering someone until we're on the receiving end." And Pete understood. The Mustang revved no more. Then there was the man who had lost everything, living out of his car, trying to piece his life back together. He had learned to let things go. Until the day the woman in the expensive SUV slammed her door into his car. She looked at him, eyes blank, and walked away without a word. If she had apologized, even just a little, he would have let it go. But she didn't, and that was a mistake. He sat there, heart pounding, staring at the fresh dent in his already battered car. Something inside him snapped. He reached for his own door handle, gripped it tightly, and swung it open. Once, twice, 3 times. When he finally stopped, her pristine SUV was no longer so pristine. He exhaled, the weight in his chest lifting. Maybe it wasn't the right thing to do, but in that moment, it felt like justice. Each of these moments was a reminder, a lesson for those who believed they could do whatever they wanted, that entitlement had consequences, and sometimes those consequences came from the most unexpected places. Life has a way of teaching lessons, often in the most unexpected ways. Some people walk through the world believing they are untouchable, that rules don't apply to them, that their desires come before anyone else's. But reality always has a way of catching up. Jack never saw the aggressive customer again, but he often wondered if the man had learned his lesson. Maybe the embarrassment of being banned from the store had humbled him. Maybe not. But Jack knew one thing for sure. That moment had changed something in him. He realized he was done letting entitled people walk all over him. He had the right to stand his ground, and if someone thought they could bully him into submission, they were in for a rude awakening. Grumpy's return had not only saved the store, but had also set a precedent. Wilhelm had walked into that place thinking he could exploit workers without consequences, that people were too desperate to fight back. He had been wrong. He had thought his position made him invincible, but he had forgotten the power of people banding together. It wasn't just about Grumpy exposing his corruption. It was about the employees realizing their worth. They had accepted mistreatment for months, believing they had no choice. But when given the chance, they took their jobs back with their heads held high, knowing they deserved better. The next time a corporate manager tried to pull the same tricks, they would not be so easily fooled. The store thrived again, proving that treating employees with respect was always the right business decision. For Alex, the silence that followed his battle with Pete was almost eerie. The Mustang, once an unavoidable noise in the neighborhood, now sat quietly in the driveway. Pete had learned his lesson, not through angry confrontations, not through shouting matches, but through an unspoken understanding. Alex had simply mirrored his behavior back at him, forcing him to experience the same frustration he had inflicted on others. The moment Pete realized he had lost control of his own comfort, everything changed. The neighborhood could finally breathe again, the quiet evenings restored, and the best part was that no official complaints had ever been filed. No one had to get involved. It was a victory won through patience and strategy, proving that sometimes the best revenge was simply making someone feel the consequences of their actions. Then there was the man with the beaten-up car, the one who had taken matters into his own hands. He never saw the woman's reaction. He had driven away, leaving behind the dents, the scratches, the proof that entitlement had a price. Some might say he had stooped to her level, that he had become the very thing he despised. Maybe they were right. Maybe there had been a better way. But in that moment, he had felt something he hadn't in a long time. Power. Not the kind that comes from money or status, but the kind that comes from taking back control, from refusing to let someone else decide his worth. And while he never sought out revenge again, he carried that moment with him, a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself was the only option. Each of these moments had started with entitlement. A man who thought he could threaten a store employee, a manager who believed he could exploit his workers, a reckless driver who thought her actions had no consequences, a neighbor who refused to respect the peace of those around him. They had all believed they could do whatever they wanted, but in the end, they had been proven wrong. Life had a way of balancing the scales, of making sure people eventually faced the consequences of their actions. Some learned the easy way, others learned the hard way, but they all learned. And so the question remains, when faced with entitlement, with arrogance, with those who believe they are above everyone else, what would you do? Would you walk away? Would you fight back? Would you find a way to turn the situation around without ever raising your voice? There is no single answer, no perfect response, but one thing is certain. No one, no matter how powerful or important they think they are, is truly untouchable. The world has a way of reminding them of that. Entitlement is everywhere, in customer service lines, in workplaces, in neighborhoods, on the road. It takes many forms. People who think rules don't apply to them, managers who exploit their workers, drivers who have no regard for others. But what matters is how you respond. Do you let it slide? Do you stand up for yourself? Do you find a way to turn the tables without escalating the situation? One of the biggest lessons from these stories is the importance of setting boundaries. If you don't, people will walk all over you. Jack's situation in the store is a perfect example. If he had let that aggressive customer get away with breaking the rules and making threats, what would stop that man from doing it again? Instead, Jack took action. He informed his manager, and the store backed him up. That's how you deal with entitlement, by refusing to let people intimidate you and by using the right channels to protect yourself. Then there's the workplace. Grumpy's story proves something we already know but often forget. Employees who are treated well work harder. Companies that respect their workers thrive. But the reality is many corporations don't see it that way. They see numbers, not people. That's why knowing your worth is so important. If you are being overworked and underpaid, if you're in a toxic environment where management exploits you, don't just accept it. Speak up. Document everything. If enough people push back, change happens. Wilhelm thought he could get away with his corruption because no one had challenged him. But when the employees, led by Grumpy, stood together, the truth came out and justice was served. Personal space and respect for others are just as important. Pete learned the hard way that what you do affects those around you. It took weeks of dealing with the same frustration he had caused before he finally understood, and Alex never had to scream, argue, or call the authorities. He just let Pete experience the problem from the other side. As something to keep in mind when dealing with difficult people, sometimes instead of yelling or trying to force someone to change, all you have to do is let them feel what it's like to be on the receiving end of their own behavior. But what about revenge? The man in the parking lot got back at the woman who dented his car without apology. Was he right? Was he wrong? It depends on who you ask. Some would say he went too far. Others would argue that he simply gave her a taste of her own medicine. The real takeaway here is that sometimes you will face situations where people will treat you unfairly, and you won't always have a clear solution. The key is knowing which battles are worth fighting and which ones aren't. So the question is, what would you do? If you were Jack, facing an aggressive customer, would you stand your ground? If you were in a toxic workplace, would you fight back or walk away? If you had a noisy neighbor who didn't care about your peace, would you find a way to make them understand? Or would you suffer in silence? And what about the parking lot situation? Would you have gotten revenge, or would you have let it go? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share your experiences. Let's talk about how entitlement affects our lives and how we can stand up to it, because at the end of the day, the way we handle these situations defines who we are. So, what would you do?